Poor people are poor people, and they don't understand. A man's got to make whatever he wants and take it with his own hands. Poor people.
Hello. Good evening. Welcome to this week's edition of Another Now with me, Yanis Varoufakis. As I keep saying at the beginning of each of these programs on Monday nights, COVID-19 has put capitalism in suspended animation. It has destroyed lives. It is causing a new tsunami of poverty, magnifying deep class and, of course, race divisions. But there are always silver linings. We've demonstrated as a society or a sequence of societies over the last months that our governments, unbeknownst to most people, do have the power to move mountains if they so wish. We've demonstrated it is not impossible to change our ways, that kindness is not dead and profit not the only motive, that, surprisingly, people can do something good for nothing, just for the hell of it. That's a very revolutionary thought, come to think of it. That politics is about who has the power to tell us what to do and what not to do. These are good reminders of where we are. Of course, all these silver linings will mean absolutely nothing unless progressives, as progressives, this time around, we succeed in doing that which bankers and racists and nationalists did after almost every capitalist crisis, especially after 2008. What did they do? They cooperated transnationally and effectively. So the question for us is, are we going to allow the masters of finance and the nationalists and xenophobes and racists to emerge from lockdown triumphant once this epidemic goes away? Or will we succeed this time and against the odds to change the world as opposed to keep interpreting it? Well, before we can even begin to coordinate, we need a vision of how we would like the world to be. It's not enough to have a vision, but it helps. The oligarchs, the beneficiaries of our current irrational system, they don't need a vision. They just want to freeze things as they are to ensure that nothing changes, that the status quo is preserved for their benefit, even if this means the end of the world. So, do we have a vision? Is there a realistic utopia that we should work towards in order to avert the dystopia which is unfolding in front of our eyes? Well, these are the preoccupations for tonight. The reason why I called this program Another Now is because over the last year or so, I've been struggling with all those questions. Could there have existed a different way of organizing society, given the same technologies? I'm not talking about Star Trek. Given the technologies constraints we face as a species, could we have done things differently at some point? Was there another road we could have taken? So the result of that preoccupation led to when I tried to write a book, which is called Another Now, which is coming out in September, a book that I had an opportunity to rethink under lockdown. And, this book is called Another Now, Dispatches from an Alternative Present. And because it turns around and revolves around these questions about, what comes after capitalism? It could be something pretty horrible and disgusting, or it could be something better. What would that better option look like? So what I'm going to do today, I don't have a guest today. I have you as my guests, and I have my great friend and comrade Judith Meyer, who is hiding behind the screen somewhere, but she will make an appearance, who is amassing questions to be put to me regarding post-capitalism, questions that were pre-thought by you before today's program, and questions that will emerge during this first half hour. I'll spend up until past, just, my own rave, to put it quite succinctly and honestly. And then for 30 minutes, I shall be asking your questions as conveyed by the wonderful Judith Meyer. let's begin at the beginning, right? Capitalism, some of the basic aspects of it, which unless we understand, there's no chance of even beginning to have a discussion about post-capitalism. Let's begin with the most shady and shifty concept in capitalism, money. Well, money, Marx put it beautifully when he said that it's the alienated capacity of humanity. It's all about who has the power to create it, and for what purpose, and what kind of powers it bestows upon those who end up having it. Now, I'm probably going to say something that most of you know, but it needs to be said once more. It's not the state that creates money under capitalism. It's mostly private bankers. Every time a banker approves a loan of, say, $1 million and gives it to Jack, let's say Jack is a businessman, so he gets a loan of $1 million. Don't imagine for a moment that $1 million exists. It's somebody else's savings and just goes to Jack. No. All that happens, believe you me, is that the banker or a banker just types 1 million, the 1000000 in Jack's bank balance. That's all it takes, typing in some numbers. Then Jack transfers these numbers from his account to the account of a supplier, let's call her Jill, to a builder, Bob, or say, some worker, Kate. In turn, Jill, Bob, and Kate transfer some of those numbers in the same way, using web banking, whatever, to others to whom they owe money, and so on. So this is what happens. Bankers create money by granting loans that take the form of numbers they type into a customer database. It's just a database. It used to be a ledger, paper ledger. Now it's an electronic database. And that database is owned by the commercial bankers, by all the bankers that share this data bank. So when money goes from one bank account to another bank's account, this is a shared interbank electronic ledger that works. For this system to be sustainable and not merely a pyramid scheme, there is a condition that down the line, the $1 million which the banker gave to Jack or typed into Jack's account will result somehow in new goods and services produced by Jack, by Bob, by Kate. Goods and services whose total value will exceed $1 million. It is this excess, the surplus, that yields the interest kept by the banker and Jack's profit. So in a sense, it is a fool's wager. Bankers plunder value from the future, right? Bring it to the present, hoping to create more value today to repay the future. Now that's retail banks, standard run-of-the-mill banks. What about the so-called investment banks? These are bigger banks and far more significant in a sense. JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs. What on earth do they do? Now, despite their name, I think it's really very crucial to remember that the one thing they do not do is to invest in skills, in equipment, in machines, in solar panels, in hospitals, in anything of tangible value. What they do is, first they create fiendishly complicated forms of debt. Large pension funds purchase those called debt instruments from the investment banks using the accumulated power of workers, because the workers, employees, pay contributions to the pension funds. This accumulates, the pension funds buy the debt instruments of the investment banks. Now, all sorts of other speculators who want to bet that these debt instruments are going to appreciate in value flood into the market. So investment bankers accumulate a huge amount of money from selling those debt instruments. And that money is lent to corporations that use it to turbocharge the price of their shares. The higher they drive these share prices, the more customers the investment banks find to buy their ever more complicated combinations of debt and shares. This is a mutual reinforcement of debt and share prices that allows the world of money, the money markets, as they say, are called, just to take off from planet Earth, to decouple from the real world, to leave the real world behind. When you compare the money that these people make with the money that real people make, there is no comparison. This is what explains it. So the end result of this decoupling of the world of money of the super funds from the world of real labor is that a handful of super funds, super companies, end up owning almost everything on the planet. Now, it isn't therefore in their nature that the wealthier these people become by creating money, the more money they will want to create. And of course, the danger of such a system is that the banks end up typing into existence sums of money vastly larger than the value of goods and services created as a result of this process. At the point when the bankers collectively have created money sums much greater than the resulting values, this decoupling means that there is a very strong possibility of a bank run. And that's, capitalism Wild West. The only way to rein the bankers in is when central banks threaten them that if there is a bank run, they're not going to step in to help them, or they will help them, but the interest rate they charge goes up. So that's, the world of money and how it connects to the world of corporations. What is crucial is to remember that, all those free marketeers, liberal economists, political economists who argue in favor of the market, they forget a very interesting aspect of capitalism. Corporations are market-free zones. The moment you get hired by a corporation, you get a job with Google, right? You leave the market and you enter its opposite. You enter a planned system, the firm, the company. Once you join a company, you start cooperating with other people, cajoling, proposing stuff, arguing, supporting ideas, inspiring, getting depressed, forming coalitions, moaning about colleagues. In other words, you enter into a relationship with other people that has nothing to do with the marketplace. So the only difference really between capitalism and the kind of post-capitalist or socialist organization of a corporation concerns the type of relationship workers experience. Under capitalism, relations within the firm, Google, Amazon, Volkswagen, relations within the firm are despotic. It's a hierarchy, top, bottom, that's it. Okay, and that is the hierarchy that determines who does what and who gets what. Is there an alternative? Is it possible to have more democratic relations? That is the question about post-capitalism. The point I want to make at this stage is that, if you're a true liberal, you cannot support capitalism. Now, some people have questioned my determination to present myself as a liberal communist or Marxist or whatever. And say, that's a contradiction. Is it? I think what is a contradiction is to be a liberal who supports corporations or corporate capitalism. Because if you think about it, from 1599, 600, when the British East India Company was set up, the first joint stock company, what you have is shareholding, the fact that ownership of a firm was cut up in tiny little pieces, and these pieces were sold anonymously to investors in the stock exchange. What started then was a remarkable machine for creating tyranny and power struggles. Very, very soon, the British East India Company had 200,000 soldiers. It pillaged India, it pillaged Indonesia, the Pacific Islands, destroyed very functionable and functioning economies far more advanced than in Britain. They corrupted the government in England through the immense wealth that they accumulated. And, this is not something that was an aberration. It extended, right? When in 1953, the first and last democratically elected Iranian government was toppled by Mossadegh's government. Well, who was it that marshaled the British and American secret services to overthrow Mossadegh? It was the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, also known as British Petroleum later. In Chile, 1973, Allende was taken down by an alliance of conglomerates like ITT and Coca-Cola, who played a very serious role. More recently, megaliths like Amazon, Facebook, Google, ExxonMobil, they are essentially beyond the control of any nation state, even if they are not performing or planning coups d'etats in various places. So liberals betray themselves the moment they turn a blind eye to this kind of hyper-concentrated power that shareholding, together with investment banking, jointly produce. Liberalism's fatal hypocrisy is to rejoice in the virtues, brewer, baker, and butcher, the small businessmen and women, when in the end, all they're doing is they are defending the vile British East India companies, the Facebooks and the Amazons, which know no neighbors, have no partners, respect no moral sentiments, and stop at nothing to destroy their competitors, as well as workers, as well as the environment. The role of technology, the way in which technology, share markets, and investment banking coalesce, create, in a sense, an industrial tyranny, an industrial feudalism, which is defended as if it was some kind of farmer's market. And what we see time and again, especially now in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis, and now with the coronavirus collapse, is that every single time the instruments of state are being employed to refloat the broken and burst bubbles of this technostructure, as John Kenneth Galbraith described this agglomeration of investment banks, shareholding, or corporations that are based on shareholding and share markets and technology. Every time they refloat this technostructure, the result is a lower capacity of humanity to provide that which it needs in terms of education, health, of course, looking after the environment, creating, civilization in a sense. So that's my soliloquy about where we are, about capitalism. What about post-capitalism? Now, post-capitalism is what comes after capitalism. There's no guarantee that what will come after capitalism is going to be any good, right? It could be a complete catastrophe, in the same way that after the Soviet Union, we didn't have democracy in Russia, we had an industrial feudalist regime. But let's try to go with the good scenario, What would a democratic post-capitalism look like? Well, to begin with, we would have corporations that operate in a civilized fashion. Imagine a corporation where there are no bosses, where decisions are being made on the basis of teams that get together spontaneously within the organization. And workers decide on how to, whom they want to work with. They have desks on wheels, as we used to say, once upon a time in Seattle, where I worked in one of those companies for a while. And they choose their projects. Imagine that they all have, from the secretary all the way to the great industrial designers of a company, they have one vote, one share. And it's a share that they can't sell. It's a bit like a library card that you get when you enroll at university. You would never think of selling it. You use it, you're entitled to it, it entitles you to the vote. And let's say that everything is decided according to electronic votes within the company. So you have a pie, total revenue, and it is divided in a number of slices. One slice is the fixed costs of the company, rents and server costs and electricity and whatever. The second slice is the basic wage that everybody gets, an equal amount for each one of them. They decide collectively, they vote how much that would be. The third slice is R&D, research and development, how much money they want to put aside so that the company develops technologically in terms of its innovations so as to grow. And then the last slice is bonuses. And how do the bonuses get decided? Well, imagine that every worker gets 100 brownie points and they have to distribute it to others whom they think have contributed the most in the company. It could be anyone. They can't distribute it themselves. And in the end, this distribution of brownie points determines who gets what percentage of the collectively decided bonus slice. So this is, and when you leave the company, you take a share of the capital with you and you go to another company. And hirings take place on the basis of democratic decision making. Anyone who wants to propose that let's say we want to hire a graphic designer, we decide whether we want to do that. Then whoever wants to be in a hiring committee enters a hiring committee. That's the kind of corporation. By the way, such corporations do exist. This is not pie in the sky. but they are not the norm. Now, this would effectively end share markets, because if shares are like library cards, and there's no market for them, and if it becomes unfathomable that we sell shares in the same way that in our society now, it is unfathomable that we sell babies or sell votes. Imagine if somebody were to propose that we have the right to sell our vote. People would be outraged. Imagine a society where the idea of selling shares is outrageous. That's the kind of democratized corporation that I am alluding to. So remember, the technostructure depends on shareholding, on investment banking. Let's go to investment banking. Suppose that every time a baby is born, the central bank, whatever central bank, the Fed in the United States, the ECB in Europe, the Bank of England in Britain, immediately opens an account for the baby and puts in there, let's say in America, $100,000, not to be collected until this baby is an adult and has a business plan, wants to do something creative with it. But the money goes in there. This is, a trust fund for every baby. You just print it. You just type it in the same way that investment bankers do it, except that this is, for every baby born. And at the same time, there's a second account in which the state puts a small amount of money every month. The state, the central bank, a basic dividend or payment just for being a citizen, or for existing, for breathing, for being part of the society that contributes to civilization. Part of which, of course, is the Google search engine. Without civilization, there would be no such thing. There would be no Apple phone, iPhone. Without the great contributions of the United States government to the projects that made all those technologies possible. So, society has contributed. Every time we travel around the world carrying a phone with us, Google Maps becomes more capitalized with information that we produce. So we are all, whether we work or not, we are contributing to social capital, even entrepreneurial capital. So a small payment, it could be small, could be something like $100, $200 to begin with. And the third account, each one of us has in the central bank, where we put our wages, we put our earnings. And if that were the case, we live in a digital world, we will be able to transfer our money anywhere we want to whomever we want. Why would you want to have an account with Deutsche Bank or Barclays Bank if you had that, if the central bank provided you with this? There would be no need. And if you had no share markets, there would be no reason for investment banks to exist. Goldman Sachs would simply go away. Remember what Goldman Sachs does? It creates bundles of debt so as to turbocharge shares. If you have no share markets and you have no retail banks, there would be no reason to have investment banks. So suddenly we're rid of all that stuff. This racket ends. And let's move a bit further. Once you have this kind of system, it's very easy to come to an agreement internationally that, let's say, something like the International Monetary Fund, which we would have to rename, because anybody who utters the acronym IMF, immediately people like me start shaking. Not just people like me, people in Africa, whose countries were destroyed in the 1970s and 80s with so-called structural adjustment programs that were the precursor of the Troika here in Greece, in Portugal, and so on and so forth. You go to South Korea and talk about the IMF, they will freak out. So let's call it something else, right? Let's call it the International Monetary Project instead of fund. And imagine that what it does is it issues an accounting unit. Let's call it the Cosmos, which is not a currency. We don't have it in our pockets. But what happens is the world's trade is denominated, and capital transfers is denominated in those Cosmos units. So when Volkswagen sells a car from Germany to Brazil, let's say, or the United States, this is denominated in Cosmos units. The Cosmos exchange rate to the euro or to the Deutschmark, if we go back to the Deutschmark, whatever, is free floating in the markets. The markets determine it as per normal, per usual. But what this gives us is the opportunity to create a common fund. A common fund, let's call it the International Redistribution and Development Fund, or depository. And it will be funded in two ways. Every country that has either an excessive debt or deficit or an excessive surplus. So if you have like Holland or Germany or China, you have a trade surplus, a certain proportion of your Cosmos units gets withdrawn, small, but it goes into this depository. Similarly, if you have too much of a trade deficit, again, some of your Cosmos units are withheld and put in there. So, okay, that's an imbalances levy. But let's also introduce what I call a surge levy. Because, one of the terrible things that happens in the world is money floods into a country like Turkey, like Brazil, when the financiers think that there is a gold mine, something's going to happen in there that is going to make their money grow immensely. So they rush in. That creates inflation, asset price inflation, bubbles. The local oligarchy feels fantastic. They start doing stuff, Then there's a crash, and then that fast money leaves the country just as fast as it entered it, and that leaves smithereens behind it, destruction. So that's why it would be good to have a surge levy. That is, a proportion of the money going into a country or leaving a country, which is an increasing function of how much money leaves the country or enters the country, is held by the International Distribution and Development Depository. And what do we do with this money? Well, we invest this money in the less developed areas in the world for the green transition. That's just an example. I could go on and on. There are ways of imagining post-capitalism. What we could do about land. We could take land, every county, every region, the land in every region, and create a ground trust that is democratically controlled, separate the land into two parts, the commercial part and the social zone. The social zone is where we build, the ground trusts build social housing. And where does the money coming from? Well, from exploiting commercially the other zone, the commercial zone. And in the commercial zone, you can have constant auctions where those who occupy the commercial properties, they do so on the basis that they self-declare what they think the value of the land is, and they get taxed accordingly. But if they under-declare, then anybody has the right to come in and say, okay, I think this is worth more. I take it immediately from you, every 6 months or whatever. So suddenly you create market incentives for commercial interests, not one that declare the value of the land and not one that pay land rent, so that the social zones can see some proper investment in social housing. Plenty of ideas that we can start conjuring up the moment we start thinking the inevitable, that capitalism, even if we don't do anything, is going to buckle under its own contradictions. I have no doubt that COVID-19 is going to make it increasingly impossible for capitalism to go back to normal. Normality has finished. The question is, are we going to have a post-capitalism worth living in, or is it going to be even worse than what we had before? So to wrap up, so that we can go to your questions. Capitalism banks on betting against the future. But the future is a fool's wager. And the greatest fools are those aiding and abetting the technostructure, and the technostructures betting away our future. The technostructure, let me remind you, are the corporations, the investment banks, and those who control the technologies. Not the technologies, but those who own and control the technologies. In 2008, it was finance that melted down. In 2020, this year, it was every market on the planet, except maybe for those for ventilators, sanitizers, and toilet paper, and masks. Very soon, there will be we will have exceeded, maybe we already have, the point of no return regarding climate calamity. This process is the inevitable repercussion of the need of capitalism constantly to be growing, not in terms of values, not in terms of the things that humanity needs, but to be growing a balance sheet in order to catch up with the banker's balance sheet, which needs to be expanding so the oligarchy can continue to enrich itself. So, post-capitalism is happening. The question is, will it be worthwhile living within it? You did. I have said everything I was going to say on my own. This is Judith Meyer, boys and girls, friends. She's in Berlin. I'm in Egina, a tiny island off the coast of Attica. Judith, thank you for doing this once again. Usually you are not seen, you are hiding behind, but tonight you're here to convey questions.
Yes, and I have collected quite a few questions. On the one hand, from people who pre-registered for this event on the DiEM25 website, and also now a few from the YouTube chat. And I think that we should start the same way you started, with a few more words about the current state of capitalism. Not to be too long, but can I give you 3 at a time? Because I think they're somehow related.
Go ahead.
Okay. So Miles is asking, why don't we have a nation-owned public bank that loans money out using government bonds or equity in existing companies as a percentage of spend for new creation of money and to lend it to the poor? And AP is asking, please, could you talk about the secular shift to inflation and the effects of current central bank policies? Finally, Panayotis is worrying whether we're going to a big brother capitalism.
A big what?
Big brother capitalism.
I'll start with Panayotis, since he's a fellow Greek. And also because in DiEM we have a long-standing relationship with Julian Assange, who is the person who should be answering this question, not me. A moment's thought for Julian, who is still languishing in Belmarsh prison. The answer I think that he would give, well, I'm not so sure, but I'll try to imagine what he would give. He would say is that there is no doubt that we're moving in a direction where there are some wonderful technologies that could be fantastically useful for humanity or to humanity. But when the ownership of these technologies is concentrated in the tiny oligarchy that is trying to weaponize it in order to maintain its power. And given now that we have the emergence of very powerful states, governments that do things, and they do this in collaboration with big tech, big business. An app that could be very useful in the sense that you have a bracelet, you wear it, it monitors your blood pressure, your temperature, or whatever, maybe even senses whether you have the damn virus or not. That would be very useful to have, and to have an app that allows us to know who is where and where. That it gives you useful tips on where to go and where not to go if you want to avoid being infected. But such a technology that monitors our coughs can easily also monitor our laughs. It can monitor the way we react to the news about George Floyd, about demonstrations, about bans on political behavior, on how we reacted when the dear leader spoke. So yes, Big Brother is being immensely aided and abetted due to the fear that people have of COVID-19 and the way in which the manufacture of money helps refloat the technostructure that owns those apps and the governments that depend on those companies for political financing. Now, you asked another 2 questions. Secular shift to inflation, there is no such thing. If you're going to worry about something, worry about deflation. Inflation is not around the corner. Deflation seriously is. And deflation is what breeds political monsters, not inflation. Inflation is a problem when it hits. But to have inflation, you need to have a lot more money chasing after the same quantity of goods. At the moment, even though governments print a lot of money, the whole idea is to generate, to have a recovery so that more goods are produced next month than this month. So there is more goods and more money, and therefore the ratio between the two is not great. The problem is that we're going to have such a catastrophic fall in investment. Investment falls always precipitate reductions in the income and prospects of the working class. That is going to create a tendency for wages and prices to come down. The moment that happens, in a never-ending reinforcement, negative reinforcement loop, business invests even less. This is the 1930s. It is not an early 1970s. As for the National Bank, yes, I'm all in favor of national public investment banks. It was part of our DiEM25's program in the May 2019 Parliament elections, our European Green New Deal. It still is. But there are more efficient ways of doing it. I think that our suggestion for having something like the European Investment Bank issue lots of bonds to soak up liquidity from the financial sector with the support of the central bank and just plow the money into green investment. I think that's the way to go.
Okay, thank you very much. And now let's move on to post-capitalism, since that is the topic of this session. So there are 3 questions about companies in post-capitalism. I think they're very similar. Claire is asking, how will companies be financed? Dominic wants to know, could a post-capitalist society implement ideas from anarcho-syndicalism or anarcho-communism? And Lentil wants to know, UBI funded by dividends is one thing, but what about straight up creating public versions of Amazon and so on?
Excellent questions. Well, firstly, yeah, I mean, fantastic questions. Firstly, how do companies get financed if you don't have investment banks? Well, remember what I said in my introduction. People must not fall for the con that investment banks fund investment. They don't. They create complicated forms of debt that turbocharge the value of share prices without actually creating any investment. Whatever investment is put into companies is, by the way, it's not the intention or the purpose of raison d'etre of investment banks. Look, I think it should come from debt. It's really very simple. It used to be even, a liberal's notion that, the little people, us, we work and we save. And then those savings are mediated through an intermediary. In our case now, with the internet, we could have apps and platforms that allow us, peer-to-peer lending to companies, individuals lending to companies, not going through banks even. And the beauty of that is that you would have real money being invested in real companies. Because the trouble with what happens under capitalism is that, I tried to allude to it in my talk, when the bank conjures up money that doesn't exist out of thin air, the Deutsche Bank, you get a loan of 100,000, you're a bicycle maker in Berlin, and you get a loan for 100,000. That money doesn't come from anybody. It's simply typed into your account. And then the hope is that your bicycle shop is going to do well, and you will make 150,000 all up, and then the bank takes a cut, and you, the bicycle workshop owner, get your profit, what is left, the residual. But if it doesn't work out that way, then suddenly the bank has a black hole in its books because the money that it conjured up never materialized. And then the bank demands a bailout from the government, and then the bailout happens on condition of austerity for you, for the customer of the bicycle shop, or even the owner of the bicycle shop. So financing should be simply on the basis of plain vanilla loans. Savings, existing savings, money that has already been saved, going into the financing of post-capitalist corporations. And with the technologies we have now, this is perfectly doable, very efficient, and it can be very democratic as well. The second question is very dear to my heart. Everything I try to describe in my 15-minute out of 30 minutes description of post-capitalism, and in particular the way corporations should function, comes from the tradition of anarcho-syndicalism. In the tradition of anarcho-syndicalism, from where I'm standing, began sometime in the 1930s in Catalonia and elsewhere, but that's my influence. The 1930s Catalan anarcho-syndicalist movement, which was, and that was its brilliance, simultaneously skeptical or inimical to corporations, to corporate power, to the tyranny of the corporation, and to the tyranny of the state, something that the Communist Party never accepted. And if you go back to the way I was describing the corporation, you know, one person, one share, one person, one vote, self-organization within the company with spontaneously created hiring committees and work groups. That is a latter-day version of you know, Catalan, Spanish anarcho-syndicalism of the 1930s. And finally, a public Amazon. Absolutely. You know, some of our comrades within DiEM, Judith, have been saying, speaking about that. You know, the problem with Google, for instance, even Amazon, is that they not only created a technology, but they created a human right. You know, the right now to use the Google engine is almost a human right. If they take it away from us, once they have provided it, I think that we have every right to be as upset as we would be if they switched off the water supply in our home. The problem, of course, is that once you've created the human right, you don't have the right to monopolize it, which means it has to be socialized. So it's not just that we need to create a public Google, Amazon, or whatever. We need to socialize the existing ones.
Thank you. So now a few people, we have quite a diverse audience. I noticed people from Europe, from Asia, from the West Coast of America, and apparently also beyond Europe. I mean, beyond the Western world. We have a question. How will the transition to post-capitalist society look like in the third world? Also, Noor is asking, can and should Europe finance the move to clean energy in developing countries? What about infrastructure to protect against floodings and droughts? And Heather also wants to know, how do you think the European economic relationship with African countries needs to change?
Well, we need to reverse colonialism. It's really very simple. When people say, oh, should Europe be paying for Africa? It's like saying, you know, should Berlin be paying for Leipzig? You know, should your brother look after your sister? There is, it's an empty question. I mean, anybody who asks this question either has the right answer already or needs to have a serious morality check. We're in this together. It's one catastrophe that we're facing in the context of climate change, of climate catastrophe, of not being able to breathe on this planet, of our oceans becoming acidic, of the coral reefs dying, of the ice caps melting and the glaciers disappearing. At the same time, poverty is exactly the same as climate change. You cannot sort out poverty in one country, but not in the one next door or in the one, you know, on the other side of the planet. We need to become a sentient, truly sentient and truly intelligent species. So I gave some pointers on how we can reconfigure international finance. The idea of the Cosmos unit, where all trade and all capital flows are denominated in a common accounting unit. I called it the Cosmos, which is a means by which effectively to set aside a fund for development around the world, and a fund which increases in proportion to the imbalances in trade and the imbalances and speed of capital flows. So that has a twin benefit, on the one hand, of stabilizing global trade and capital flows and money flows, because effectively you are taxing imbalances. So that's good. You know, you are stabilizing trade and capital flows and money flows while creating a fund out of this stabilization process for investing in Africa, for investing in parts of the United States that are Western Africa in terms of the despair of the people there. because let's not forget that there are pockets of the third world in the first world, and vice versa. So it's not just a geographical distribution of misery and wealth. Once you start thinking in those terms, and you have this kind of cosmos unit, which is an international currency unit, which, just like central banks can suddenly decide to create a lot more euros or yen or dollars in order to help an ailing economy. Well, the international authority that issues the cosmos could issue a few more of them in order to meet our green investment targets as a species. So yes, absolutely. Either we think rationally as a collective, or we perish.
Great. Wait, let me put me so. Okay. Next we have some more practical questions. I think everyone is wondering, how could all this be implemented, especially if you're only able to do so in one country? Is it, for example, Rusen is asking, Yanis, I agree with you that the universal basic dividend can be funded by sharing capital and not taxation. The question is, how do we get there? Is this something the Western world needs to act together to avoid non-UBI havens for companies? Is this possible?
It's harder than that. It's harder than that because, our governments are never going to do it. And they will never eliminate tax havens because they are in the pockets of the oligarchy that uses tax havens and who don't care about universal basic dividends, incomes, whatever. So here we come to the part of the discussion today that is difficult because it's one thing to have a vision of what post-capitalism would look like. It's quite another to come up with a theory or a plan for change. How do we implement it? The older I get, the more radical I become. And I come to the conclusion that it's not going to be the result of some smart idea that convinces people around the world, and especially the powerful, to do it. It will have to be done through confrontation. Only conflict, political revolution is going to bring this about. Now, that doesn't mean bloodshed. There are political revolutions that have taken place, thankfully, peacefully. But they were revolutions nevertheless. They were ruptures from the past. They were not the result of convincing the powers that be that they got it wrong and that there is a better way of doing it. There is no way that the powers that be, whether this is in Europe, in Africa, in the United States, in wherever, are going simply to be convinced by great ideas, even by wonderful blueprints, unless we confront them. But the question is, who are we? It will never happen in one country. We tried that, in 1917. And the result was industrial, an industrial tyranny that emerged out of the Stalinist experiment. It was a very interesting one, but nevertheless, it wasn't one I would want to live in. If I lived in it, even as a Marxist, I would end up in a gulag. There's no doubt about that. I would be the first one to be in the gulag. So what kind of political revolution do we need? Firstly, it must be global. It must be international. That's why you know this better than anyone. We are working as part of DiEM25 to help build the Progressive International, a movement across the globe that works together. But what we do, let's say that we have millions and millions and millions of people organizing in the Progressive International. But what's the point? Well, I have this wild dream of simultaneous, multiple actions to bring down capitalism, and to bring it down peacefully. Here are some examples of these multiple actions. One is really very simple. Imagine that in support of Chris Smalls, the wonderful employee at Amazon, who in February staged a strike in New Jersey against the working conditions at the Amazon warehouse where he worked. Imagine instead of doing petitions and stuff, which is what we're good at, in other words, being effective, instead, we organized a global day of inaction, calling upon the citizens of Earth for one day. They say, next Monday, none of us even visit the Amazon website, just for one day. Don't buy anything from Amazon, don't visit their website for one day. It's not a great sacrifice not to visit Amazon.com for one day, but it would be a massive blow against Amazon. and Chris Smalls would be reinstated. Imagine such actions that are global, but also local on a daily basis, 10 of them every day, or even one of them each day. That's just one, that's the simplest thing. Imagine if we had a group of financial engineers that we could unpick the collateralized debt and loan obligations, the CDOs, the derivatives, and we found out exactly what they contained in there. And we had surgical strikes in this, let's say, take a water authority in Britain, which was privatized and which is absolute crap, both at safeguarding the environment, providing, investing in the water supply, industrial relations with its workforce, and so on. And also, it pushes water prices through the roof. It adds debt upon debt on the company. There are these companies, we know that they exist. So imagine if we found, we know what they do. The moment they get privatized, they immediately sell, 20 years worth of future bills, income from customers. They sell it to investment bankers. Investment bankers splice this up, all the future water bills of people from Yorkshire or whatever. They splice it up in tiny bits. They put them in CDOs. Imagine if we had a team of financial engineers that unpicked all that and found out which CDO had, what customer in it or whose water bill in it. And we were to organize customers in rolling payment strikes, and said, look, don't pay your water bill for a month, just for a month. You'll get a fine. We will crowdsource the fine. So people around the world are going to help you repay even your fine. So it's not a criminal offense. You get a fine, you get it paid by all of us. But by doing this in an orchestrated way, we can bring down those companies in the stock exchange. Imagine if we could combine customer strikes, worker strikes across the globe, attacking the oligarchy without borders simultaneously around the globe. And we had a plan for how we wanted to change corporate law, central bank accounts for everyone, a trust fund for every baby, a universal basic dividend in Nigeria, in India, in Brazil, in Greece, in Britain, in Germany, everywhere. Then we would be talking.
Okay, sounds exciting, but there is one person with an even more bleaker view of the future than you maybe. This is Alessandro, DSC coordinator of Trieste, and he's worrying that capitalism is now declining towards open war, as has happened almost always in the past. How can we best organize ourselves to prevent this?
You may very well be right, because one of the problems with, or blessings of the way in which the 2008, both problem and a blessing, the way in which 2008 was handled, the crisis, was we didn't have a war. At least we didn't have a large-scale war in Europe, in America, a world war. That was a good thing. But at the same time, it meant that all the excess capacity that capitalism could no longer utilize remained there, and it had deflationary effects, and the deflationary effects, as always, as I said before, create political monsters, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Trump in the United States, Salvini in Italy, since Alessandro is in Trieste, and complete right-wing xenophobia, even amongst traditional center-right, center-left parties. So is this intensification of capitalism's crisis as a result of COVID-19 going to lead to war? Maybe it will. How do we respond to that? I think the answer I gave just before. We need a global movement, a progressive international, that binds us together across different jurisdictions, continents, and so on, gives us a vision of a post-capitalism worth struggling for. And I think that this is the best antidote to militarism, nationalism, xenophobia that leads to wars.
Okay, and maybe the final question, because it's very relevant right now. Alexander asks, what do you see as concrete next steps for Americans looking to end racist or capitalist policing? And we had another question in the chat. Now I lost it. But someone was asking, what do you think of the defund police movement?
Well, you're talking to somebody who has a problem with the concept of the army, the concept of the prison, the concept of the courthouse. Not that we don't need a justice system. In post-capitalism, we will need to have a justice system. But when you have a society that revolves around the concentration of exorbitant power in the hands of an unscrupulous oligarchy, which is effectively amassing the surplus value of the world amongst its small number of 0.1% of the population, maybe even less. And in so doing, intensifies the destitution of the many as the opposite sign of the same coin, which is their just ridiculous hyper wealth, money that they would never even be able to count, let alone spend in their lifetime or in the lifetime of 20 generations ahead. In the end, they end up locking themselves up in behind tall walls in gated communities. They have security guards. They weaponize the police. They turn the police into an army to defend their castles. We've seen this everywhere, from New York State, California, to Pakistan, to Greece, to Egypt. So then it's not a question of policing. It's not a question of justice. It's a question of an undeclared war against the people whose lives are intentionally wasted in order to sustain the unsustainable. So do I want to defund this? Yeah, I do. But it's not but that's not the issue. The issue is to deny them the instruments of their enrichment, not simply to say to the police, because let's not forget that the police are also, I know that some of our comrades and friends and viewers are not going to like that, but they're victims. They're working class, destitute kids that are being turned against other working class, destitute kids. In the interests of those who use their power to enrich themselves against the interests, against the many and against the planet. So, my advice is save your anger for the oligarchy without frontiers, without borders, and don't talk about defunding the police so much. Defund the oligarchy.
On that note, because we just had another question on defunding the oligarchy, what is your opinion about putting an absolute maximum in the amount of wealth that an individual can accumulate? Everyone is talking about a minimum wage, but never about a maximum wealth.
Look, I understand where you're coming from, but there is a better way of doing it. Ban share markets. And share markets, I said that in my talk. We take it for granted that a chunk of a company can be bought and sold anonymously at the speed of light. What if I were to write a dystopic science fiction book where chunks of babies can be bought and sold, or votes, and people buy votes and they get elected all the time, which more or less happens, but it's not that mind-bogglingly obvious. You'd say, oh, well, that can't possibly happen. Well, let's work towards a society where the notion of tradable shares becomes unfathomable, impossible to contemplate. And that, if you do that, and you have a bank account for every person in each of our central banks, so effectively you get rid of banks, private banks, and you get rid of share markets. Then suddenly no one can ever accumulate huge quantities of wealth. You don't need an upper limit then.
Thank you. I believe that's it for tonight. Any final words?
Well, it was strange talking on my own, but thank you, Judith, for bringing everyone else in and your good self. Next week, we have one of the top artists who have marked this planet with wonderful sculptures. Anish Kapoor is going to pay us a huge honor to be with us in exactly a week from today, Monday night, Another Now with Anish Kapoor.